We're here today to commemorate a day that still lives in infamy, December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor. I'd like to share a real quick snippet of mine. I'm beyond fortunate enough to be able to fly this airplane to air shows or aerial events. And the thing that has struck me almost every time is that Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, is still very much alive and well in the American psyche. So it's a pleasure for the unit here, the Southern California wing of the Commemorative Air Force, to put this presentation on today. Here's what we've got in store for you. So starting from now, we've got a little bit of a presentation. Ron over here is going to talk about the attack itself and some of the people that were involved in that attack. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Zero in general. And then one of our other members, Ricky Chen, is going to come up and he's going to talk about the history of this airplane right here and how it went from the jungles of New Guinea to our ramp.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk about Pearl Harbor, but I'm going to talk about people more so than the actual events. It's been 74 years, give or take a couple of days right now. And Pearl Harbor didn't really start December the 7th. It started way before this. Now, I'm going to apologize for the low-tech graphics. Didn't have time to get these all digitized. We're going to talk about two islands. We're going to talk about, I'm not even going to hold these up because you guys can't see them from here, but we're going to talk about two islands, Oahu, where Pearl Harbor is located, and an island called Nahu, which is the most far western island of the Hawaiian chain. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor, you can go back as far as 1937 with the Japanese aggression in China. And it was obvious that we were going to go to war. And probably we were going to go to war with Japan and eventually go to war with the Germans. By 1940, Europe had been completely captured for the most part. England stood alone. And France had been conquered, which gave the Japanese the opportunity to go after Indochina. And they had been fighting the war in China. And Roosevelt decided we're going to try to do this diplomatically. So there was the embargo. The embargo on steel, the embargo on petroleum products. The Japanese are very talented people, but to make something, you have to have something. They didn't have petroleum, they didn't have a lot of steel. To get the embargo lifted, they said, well, if you'll pull out of China and pull out of Indochina, which was just totally, the Japanese weren't going to do it. Nomura and the other Japanese ambassador came over to talk peace. The 14-page document, which was supposedly being typed up too late because the 14th page, they didn't have a good clerk typist. The Japanese early on, several weeks before Pearl Harbor, before December 7th, secretly put their fleet out and the carriers. They were ready. And as they steamed closer to Pearl Harbor, and everyone says, well, they didn't declare war. The Japanese never declared war. After Pearl Harbor on December 8th, the emperor did issue a proclamation basically declaring war. And they say Adolf Hitler's biggest mistake was he declared war on the government of the United States. And we went after the Germans more so than the Japanese. Now, the Japanese attack was in two waves. The first wave came over and it hit Wheeler Field, Iwo, Marine Base, and Pearl Harbor, and Hickam Field. The second wave came in, hit the Navy base, I'm going to mangle a lot of pronunciations here, Kaneohe Bay and Bellows Field, and Hickam Field again. The attack didn't last very long, as attacks go. Our ships were lined up in harbor. It was a nice, quiet Sunday, as everybody knows. Most of the guys were either sleeping or ashore. The guys on the Arizona, there was a competition, a big band competition, a battle of the bands. The officers' club had a big party, and several of the pilots, when it became obvious that there was going to be an attack, got a car, raced out to one of the fields, got into the airplane. Two of these pilots, Ken Taylor and George Welsh, managed to get up, managed to score some hits, several as a matter of fact. But a lot of people don't realize there were other people. There were approximately 4 or 5 other pilots flying P-40s and the obsolete predecessor, the P-36, which looks like a P-40 with a round engine. And they managed to make some kills. They got a fellow named Sanders, which no one ever hears about, Second Lieutenant Rasmussen, Ken Taylor, George Welsh, and Harry Brown. Now, I have pictures of all these guys. Next time we do this presentation, we'll have graphics on these. So let's talk about 2 of the pilots, Ken Taylor and George Welsh. Taylor, they were both second lieutenants. Taylor and they were flying P-40s. Taylor had an Air Force career, stayed in the Air Force, became a general, retired out of the Air Force, moved to Alaska, took over the Alaska Air National Guard until he retired out of that. And then after he retired, his son took over the Alaskan Air Guard. It's the only time in Air Force history that you have a father and son combination that took over the same command. George Welsh, for some reason that I can't find, retired out of the Air Force in 1944. He took a job with North American as a test pilot. And he eventually was killed flying an F-100 Sabre in 1954. But prior to that, he did a lot of spectacular but maybe not noted things with the F-86. And unofficially, they say that George Welsh broke the sound barrier before Chuck Yeager. And the reason it was never accounted for was the fact that no one was there to time it. And they say he may have done it in a dive, whereas Yeager did it basically straight and level. And I have pictures of these guys, should you like to see them a little bit later. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor, everybody blames the 2 guys who were in charge. You had Admiral Kimmel for the Navy, and husband E. Kimmel, new to Pearl Harbor. He had just taken over command of the Pacific Fleet because the admiral who was in charge before him protested maybe a bit too strenuously about moving the fleet from the United States to Pearl Harbor, and he was replaced by Admiral Kimmel. And they were not on alert because they thought even though there was going to be an attack and messages were flying back and forth, they thought it was going to be the Philippines. Okay, Walter Short, who was command of the Army forces, also a career officer, as most people in Pearl Harbor, because of the large Japanese population, did not trust the population, and all the airplanes neatly arranged in rows so they could be guarded better. And as we found out, this was not the thing to do. They were relieved of their command, and as they're finding out later on, they had requested more help at Pearl Harbor, never got it. The following year, they did a hearing, and they found out that messages that were supposedly sent to them never arrived. And it goes on and on and on to 1944 that they had another hearing. The Navy said, nope, we're going to stick with what we got. And finally, in 2001, tacked on to an appropriations bill, they absolved them, saying that they did the best they could with what they had, knowing what they knew. Well, then it was too late. Okay, now that's the American side of the situation. Let's talk about the Japanese side of the situation. The Japanese, under really nasty conditions, had this battle fleet with carriers going through North Pacific, really, really rough waters. It was planned by, this one I can show you because it's big enough. This is Admiral Yamamoto, planned the attack, also knew that whatever was going to happen was going to be temporary. Give me 6 months and I will run rampant through the Pacific, and after that, no promises. Shot down later in the war. This gentleman, another Admiral Nagumo, in charge of the ships, launched the 2 waves. The thing that good for the United States, but really not good for the Japanese, was after the second attack, let's launch a third one. Nope, let's get my ships out of there. The Americans are now alerted. Didn't come back, didn't get the fuel tanks, didn't get the rest of the ships, and as a result, we had fuel and oil in Pearl Harbor when we needed it. Most of the ships were either rebuilt or refitted. They were obsolete anyways. If you look at the picture of the Arizona. Arizona was gone completely. The Oklahoma turned turtle. The Nevada made a run for it. Couldn't make the entrance at the base, so it grounded itself. This is a picture, I know you guys can't see this. That is Fuchida, interesting man. Led the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the war, got religion, converted to Christianity, became a missionary. This is General Short. This is Admiral Kimmel. Now, when did the first shot get fired? The first shot was actually fired not by an airplane, but by a destroyer, the USS Ward. And the Ward was crewed by gentlemen who were from the National Guard from Wisconsin. Now, what happened to the Ward was very interesting. It was taken back to the United States. It was converted into a troop transport and served valiantly throughout the Pacific. And just about 3 years later, on December 7th, hit by kamikazes, damaged the ship irreparably. They said, get out. Gunfire from the O'Brien. And the O'Brien, the commanding officer of the O'Brien was William W. Otterbridge. William W. Otterbridge was the CO of the Ward on Pearl Harbor. So the war does strange things. The only survivor of the Ward passed away in 2015. The only piece of equipment to survive is a deck gun that's in Minnesota. Now, let's talk about another little island. The farther westernmost island is an island called Nahu, N-I-I-H-U. And this island is a plantation, 126 people on the island. 3 of them were Japanese, okay? One of the airplanes that bombed Pearl Harbor, second wave, was flown, I'll get you this picture in a minute, was damaged, and Japanese intelligence said that this is a good island to land on because there's nobody there. Well, there were people there. and I am really going to mangle this pronunciation. Shigenori Nishikatachi, that's his picture, okay? Crash landed the airplane on this island. It was a plantation island. No one got to this island without permission of the man who owned the island. And over the next day and a half, it's like almost like a Keystone Cops comedy. Of the 126 people, 3 were Japanese. They basically sided with him. He was locked up, the guard went to the bathroom, he got out, he got the guard's shotgun, they went to see the people that had his papers and his revolver. He got a hold of the shotgun, got a hold of the gun, and one of the people that he ended up fighting with was a gentleman and his wife and one of the locals on the island. And his name was, and I'm not going to do the Hawaiian pronunciation, but his name was Ben Kanalahi, okay? During the fight, this is Ben and his wife Ella. During the fight, like I say, the gun was taken from the guy who had the gun. Ben was shot 3 times. Apparently this made him mad because he picked this poor Japanese pilot up, threw him through a wall, at which time the wife jumped on the guy and slit his throat. By the time things finally settled down, and Mr. Anderson, who owned the island, got over there, for a couple of days, he couldn't get over there because no one was doing any surface travel. And they found out what was going on. During the fight, one of the 3 Japanese shot himself, got a hold of the shotgun again, killed himself. So the woman, that was her husband, she was now a widow. She did a little bit of time, a couple months in jail. Her husband, the other Japanese collaborator, if you will, nothing happened to him. They both came back to the island and they lived on the island for the rest of their life. Awards were given. Ben was given 2 medals. His wife was, I guess they just said, thank you. So no award went to Ella. Now our connection with this airplane, if you were over here, I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a kind of a wrecked Zero. That Zero is now over in the Pacific Museum of Flying over in Honolulu, and the wreckage is there. The other Zero that we had is now put together and it's restored in the markings of the Japanese pilot. I'm not even trying to pronounce it. I'll let you guys look that one up. History is everywhere. And we have a lady who works at City Hall, whose aunt was a visiting nurse at the time. And from the wreckage, this chunk of metal was carved out and engraved from the crash. And this goes into our collection. We also have some pieces of our Crash Zero in our display. So we have part of the Naha Incident Zero. The Zero that we used to have on display is over there. And I have one other little interesting thing dealing with people. Talk about a guy having a bad day. The Japanese launched 5 midget submarines. None of them hit the target. One was destroyed by the Shaw, one was destroyed by another destroyer. One guy, his name, I'll mangle this name too, Keizu Sakamaki. He had the distinction of becoming U.S. prisoner of war #1. He implored the United States after he was captured that he be allowed to kill himself. They wouldn't let him do it. We have his prison record, nice picture. Under the chai, he has 3 cigarette burns, which were probably self-inflicted. They don't go into detail about that. The Japanese were extremely not happy with him because, unlike the code of the samurai, he gave himself up, he did not die in battle. They published this postcard if you count the heads, you're only going to find 9 heads. He became a non-entity. Just didn't die gloriously in battle, so they just forgot about him. Returned to Japan after the war, became a clerk for Toyota, eventually worked himself up to the man who was in charge of Brazilian production of Toyotas. Came back to the United States in 1961 for a conference, and his submarine, which had been created around all during the war to sell bonds, is now in the Nimitz Museum. And he hadn't seen the submarine for 50 years. And it said he approached the submarine and he cried. It was the first time he saw the submarine. Now, I've just glanced over a lot of the Pearl Harbor history. My out is, if you watch television on Sunday night, they're doing a special on Pearl Harbor. So the graphics will be way better than what I have. And they'll go into a lot more detail in some of these. And the only thing that I can say about Pearl Harbor is what one of our members, Clifford Ron, who gave a presentation several years ago. He said, whether you want to forgive Pearl Harbor, that's up to you, but you should always remember Pearl Harbor. And with that, I thank you all for coming.